Now, this is the third Human Rights Day in the era of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, one would ask, how did the pandemic impact on human rights of ordinary South Africans, specifically with regards to vaccine mandates? Well, some interesting outcomes from a study conducted by the Human Sciences Research Council. And let's bring in Acting Research Director Benjamin Roberts. Thank you very much for your time this morning, Benjamin. Maybe share with us some of these interesting features that came out of the study that was conducted.
Yeah, thank you, Rofhiwa, and hi to the viewers. I think the survey has been done over the past 2 years. It's the UJ HSRC Democracy Survey. And it's really looked at the experiences, the lived experiences of COVID-19, both in terms of and the bearing that's had on people's beliefs and preferences. So I think in terms, what we've really looked at is the willingness to sacrifice temporarily human rights it's sort of in the concern of the greater good. So we've looked very much at how that pro-sacrifice has changed over the period of the last 2 years. And we've also looked at how does it matter on things such as support for vaccine mandates or even just getting the vaccine, not just a mandate. And what we've found is there's a very strong association. Firstly, it's important to recognize the suffering that South Africans have endured over the past 2 years, but that is linked to a strong preference for willing to sacrifice in the short term to get COVID-19, get in control of COVID-19 and stop the spread. So we find on average across all 5 rounds of surveying we've done from March 2020 right till late last year, that 74% are willing to make that sacrifice. Obviously, that's come with a big consequence. And, we've just seen from the previous video clip, those sacrifice of rights comes with real societal responsibilities. It comes with a responsibility around ensuring there's sufficient social relief for those that are struggling to make ends meet. It also is important to look at issues around what bearing it might have on regulatory compliance throughout the past period. So mask wearing, support for the regulations, willingness to get the jab, as well as support for mandates have all been linked to this willingness to sacrifice.
It's a very interesting notion, this willingness to sacrifice. And obviously, at the peak of the pandemic in 2020 and largely into 2021, there was probably an increased willingness. But now, as we move forward from the peak of the pandemic, do you anticipate that people will be less willing to sacrifice their rights to drink alcohol when they want, not having to wear masks, the vaccine mandates that you've just talked about? I'm just asking about the level of sacrifice that people will be willing to do going forward.
It's still at very high levels, although it's in the latest round that we conducted, which was in October, November last year, we did see it start dipping. So in the previous rounds, we'd seen it in the 72 to 78% range, for those willing to sacrifice. With the last round, it dropped about 10 percentage points down to 64%. What we've seen is it's very much linked to one's sort of outlook on the pandemic, whether you think the worst is yet to come or whether we're over the worst. So if people believe that we're now the worst of the COVID-19 impacts are behind us, then there was a tendency to believe, a slight decline in the general willingness to sacrifice. But what we've seen over this 2 years of surveying is really that there's when South Africans need to make those very difficult sacrifices, they are willing to do so. We're a very resilient nation. And I think, that South Africans do want to come together. They do want to help out. They do want to play their part. So that slight decline that we've seen in recent times, even though it's still very high at 64%, is a reflection of the changing outlook on the pandemic. But when we cut to the chase, and we do need to make those very uncomfortable at times sacrifices, we do come through and make them.
Benjamin, tell us, how was the data collected in terms of the research you conducted? How was that done? You said it's something that you've initiated since 2020, but how was that data collected to make these findings?
So when we started the survey, the UJHSRC COVID-19 Democracy Survey, it was a time in the hard lockdown period when we were not allowed to go and do face-to-face interviewing. So we looked for suitable means of surveying the public that ensures that we get a reasonable representation of society, the broad characteristics of society across race, class, and other variables. So what we used is a data-free app called Moya Messenger, and it's got about 8 million active subscribers. And we used that to administer a short survey of about 50 questions in total. And each round ended up with about between 7,000 to 10,000 completed responses. And those were weighted with the former Statistician General. We worked with Dr. Mark Orkin. We worked and we matched certain characteristics to the StatsSA's demographic attributes to give it, to sort of give a sense of broad indication of what the public has been thinking. So that's a method we've sworn by throughout the last 2 years. Now that we are able to do face-to-face interviewing again, we are replicating some of these questions as an extra check just to see that the kind of findings we're coming up with were valid, and it does seem to be the case.
We've run out of time, Benjamin, but I must ask you, as you talk through the conclusion and the recommendations within this particular survey, it's indicated that there is a dark side to the positive findings of this report, the positive findings being that people are willing to sacrifice their human rights in the time of a desperate need. But what would you say is the dark side?
Well, it's the inherent risk, and obviously with the rollout of the application of the Disaster Management Act, there's a certain degree of responsibility on the state to not act in an authoritarian way. So, people are willing to make those sacrifices, but there is that real obligation on the state to act in an appropriate way. We did see certain instances of police brutality during the course of the pandemic, and there were real concerns about state overreach. So that's really the dark side, that we have to make sure that there's strong independent monitoring of state actions in the time of disasters.
Absolutely. Benjamin Roberts, Acting Research Director at the Human Sciences Research Council. Thank you very much for your time this morning, talking us through a survey that indicated that South Africans were largely willing to sacrifice some of their freedoms to deal with the pandemic when it was at its peak.